All right, so this is just going to be a quick tutorial on A10-Rameses, which is designed to hopefully give you a little more experience with the MVC design pattern before you get into that final project. The final project is usually pretty difficult in terms of design, and a lot of students in previous semesters were struggling with just going from straight from class slides to like a full-blown MVC if they had no experience with it previously. So hopefully you've taken a little look at the assignment before jumping to this tutorial and giving it a shot. And you're falling back on this because you're looking for maybe some extra hints. I'm going to go through the process that I like to use to make an MVC project like this. Give me 1 second, got to silence something. But yeah, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. So first things first, I like to take a look at the model. And in this assignment, you should have this model interface provided for you already, which is going to tell you a couple things that you should have in that model impl class, right? And if we go back to our class slides and we look at the model view controller in that setup again, we want the model to store the application state, provide algorithms for data manipulation. Okay, so we look at the model and take a look at what we might need here, and then we can go straight into implementing it. So we're going to need a Boolean to track if we're on loves me or loves me not. We're probably also going to want a counter to track how many times the button has been clicked on the screen. And then we're also going to need a list of observers for the MVC design pattern. And this is where a lot of people get tripped up, how to add observers and what that actually means. And we'll get into that later, but you do need a list of observers for the MVC pattern. So as you can see, we've got our basic constructor. We're going to start off loves me is true. You don't necessarily have to have that for the purposes of this project. We're going to initialize our array list. And then we're going to have a couple things. We're going to have getters to expose some of the model fields. And again, if we go back to the slides, we'll know that these are going to be necessary for implementing that classic MVC design pattern, which is what we're going to be rolling with here so that the view can have access to these. And then we're going to have our method or our algorithm that we want for our model. So all we need to do for the purposes of this assignment is have a way to switch loves me to loves me not. That's going to be pretty simple, right? And we're going to do it through this ask method because we're asking if it loves me or loves me not. And then we're going to increase the count every time we ask. And finally, and probably the most important part, we have to notify our observers that a state changed within the application, okay? You can also do some additional practice by trying to add a reset button. And like I said here, don't forget to notify the observers. So the methods below are for our MVC purposes. We're going to want a way to add observers to our list, remove them, and also notify them as well when our application state changes. And so when our application state changes, we basically just want to go through and update all our observers with the model that we're watching. So that pretty much covers the model. This is probably the simplest part of setting up this application. And next, typically we go to the control and we see what we need to control in the model, right? So we want to have a reference to our model as a field in our controller impl class. And then since we really only have one method here that we need to control, which is this ask method, that's what we are going to set up. So we can now delegate the task of calling this method to our controller instead of accessing it directly through the model. All right, so if you're moving on to the view, and this is typically the most tricky part of setting up these applications, especially because we don't really get a ton of experience working with JavaFX in COMP301. my first suggestion before looking at this coding tutorial is just to draw it out. Whenever you're trying to set up a view, I would suggest drawing it out on paper, like just getting a pen and paper and looking at the classes and the things that you have available to you through JavaFX. So I would look at the official documentation, look at the different panes and see how the layouts are oriented. Maybe look at things like the VBox, just trying to understand what this means, and then try to set up a design on paper of what you might want your application to look like, okay, based off these components. So I'm going to give you a chance to do that, and then go ahead and hop back here if you need more help. Okay, so the next thing for the view is, I think it's important to have a main view class to bind all of our components together. And so we'll take a look at the main view first. And let's examine what's in this class. So if you look at the write-up for the assignment, what we really want is some buttons to interact with the application, right? Ask loves me or loves me not. And then we also want an image that changes based off of that value. So this main class is basically gonna act as the container for the image and the buttons all at once. And so the purpose of having this main class is it's gonna allow us to really control the layout of those things and also change them individually so that we're not having to change an entire class all at once. It isolates the logic for the different components, and it helps you with testing it as well. Excuse me. So as you can see here, we're setting up a Rameses view, which is what's going to have our image. We're setting up a button view, which contains our buttons. And we're passing in both a model and a controller to both of those. And we'll come to understand why we're doing that in a little bit. But first, we need to set up our initial scene, maybe add our style sheet if we're planning on adding some style to it. And finally, the most important part is adding this view as an observer to our model so that every time our update method is called, our view is going to re-render the components, okay? And in our render method, we're setting up a border pane, right, as the main housing unit for this application. Sorry. And here's the border pane, right? So we know this is what it looks like. And then we're setting the top of the border pane to the image, and we're setting the bottom to the buttons. Okay, so let's take a look at what those components look like. So here is one of the components that helps render the image. And in this one, we're going to be using a VBox. And the steps to do that, we're going to get the children. We are going to call this helper method here that helps us make an image. And we're going to use the image view class to do that. These are going to be located down in our resources below. And so once that image is created, as you can see here, we're using the model's getter methods to determine which one we want to display in the view. Then we need to add that to the children of our pane and return it. And so I would encourage you to go back again and look at the class slides if you're confused on the overall setup of how things like panes and the different scenes work. See if I can pull up the scene graph on one of these. It was on this slide deck. So yeah, I would encourage you to go back and look at this if you're still a little bit confused on adding children, getting children for these different panes and objects. Okay, so next is our button view. And the button view is going to control all of our controls, and it's also going to have the counter that keeps track of how many times the button was clicked. And so when you're designing these JavaFX applications, I would encourage you to combine different components to get the layout that you want. So here we're going to use both a VBox and an HBox to get this set up properly. And so we can use our model to determine what is displayed, the method dynamically. And we're going to do that based off of the Boolean value that it currently has. And then we're going to add the appropriate message. And then we're going to have an HBox, which displays components in a horizontal manner, hence the name HBox, to store both the buttons and the counter. And so how we're doing this is the VBox is going to contain the message, and then the next item in the VBox is an HBox, so we can have nested components like that. And so we have a message on top of an HBox, and that HBox is going to contain all of our buttons and counters that we need to have access to. Here's initializing a button. We need to remember to set the action of the button. And then, as you can see, we forward that task to the controller by calling the ask button method. And what that's going to do is going to call our ask method in our model, right? Finally, we can set the style. Then you remember that we always have to add our components to the pane, children. Okay. So that's what's being rendered in our main class. And hopefully you can see why it's best practice to split up our different components like that to allow for easier testing and isolation of the logic. Finally, that brings us to our last class, the app launcher, which is basically our starting point in our application, where we can actually create a model, create a controller, and then we're going to create our main view. And you can see here that we also now only have to create one view in our app launcher class, as opposed to creating maybe 3 or 4. And we can just pass in that model and that controller. And just to go back and highlight again, that model and controller that we're now passing in are going to be shared between all these different views. Finally, we're just going to set the scene, set the title, and then show our stage. We'll go over here, run our application, see what it looks like. Excuse me. Okay, and here is our application. We can see the title being displayed at the top. We can see our image based off of the message that's being displayed. And you can see here, there's a VBox, right? As the label appears above these. And then the HBox is allowing this button to appear horizontal to this counter here, this label. When we click the button, we get a message change, and we also get a picture change, which is what we want. And then the counter will increase as well based off of how many times we click it. Okay, so that wraps up the tutorial. Hopefully this was helpful, and good luck.